How does a rock star who makes so much money lose it all? If you're too young to remember American Bandstand in its heyday, you may not know Jackie Wilson. He was one of rock and roll's first big names.
Jackie was a performer's performer. He had the smile, the flash. That's what was great. He would do this and the women was, ah!
Yet in Jackie Wilson's case, Bob Brown found a different story. If the music of rock and roll helped shatter innocence, the business of rock and roll was not an innocent game.
Jackie Wilson was in debt. He owed an estimated $300,000 in back taxes and well over $100,000 to a company owned by the man he had trusted to keep his financial affairs straight.
Have you ever wondered what really happened to Jackie Wilson, the man who was supposed to be the next king of pop? The official story is that he died of natural causes after collapsing on stage, but is that really the whole truth?
It was a classic story of how money had melted away from a young performing artist and materialized in other people's hands.
So, was there something far more sinister at play? For decades, rumors have been swirling, whispers in the dark corners of Hollywood, hinting that Wilson's untimely death was no accident.
He was always going to his managers and publishers for quotes, advances or something that he would want to buy.
Could it be that the powerful, shadowy figures who control the entertainment industry had a hand in his demise? Jackie Wilson, known as Mr. Excitement, was more than just a superstar. He was a man who had a voice that could move mountains and a stage presence that left audiences spellbound. But what if his talent wasn't the only thing that made him a target? Insiders have long suggested that Wilson was caught in the crosshairs of Hollywood's underworld, a sinister network of mobsters and corrupt industry elites who wouldn't think twice about silencing anyone who crossed them.
But the game that was being played is, okay, Jackie, buy it. And there was no protection of his money. In fact, it was actually stealing of his money.
Was Jackie Wilson silenced because he knew too much about the industry's dirty secrets? Or was he punished for refusing to play by their rules, a lone wolf who dared to defy the power brokers who demanded complete control?
You now let's look at the books. You took this amount. Jackie was never aware, of how much he took or how much he was spending.
And why has this story been buried so deep, with those who dare to question it often discredited, threatened, or worse? Some say Wilson was becoming too powerful, too influential, a threat to the status quo in an industry where control is everything.
In those days, I'm sure Jackie just assumed it was all being taken care of.
Considering this, Wilson had a series of financial and legal troubles that seemed to come out of nowhere. Could these have been orchestrated to keep him in check or to push him to the brink?
If you look at the back of the records, you start seeing other names, the names of some of the publishers' names, some of the record producers' names who did write those songs.
And what about the people who surrounded him? Were they truly friends, or were they planted by the very forces that sought to destroy him? Even his tragic collapse on stage raises eyebrows. Why did it take so long for him to receive proper medical attention, and who benefited from his career being cut short?
How does a rock star who makes so much money lose it all?
As we dig deeper into the mysterious circumstances surrounding Wilson's death, you might just start to see the cracks in the official narrative. Why did key witnesses suddenly change their stories or disappear altogether?
Where were they? This loving family. They've been like vultures over a carcass.
Why were certain documents sealed, and why has there been such a concerted effort to paint Wilson's death as a tragic accident rather than a calculated move by those who had everything to gain from his silence?
You're convinced Jackie Wilson was neglected in the time he spent in the hospital?
Absolutely.
Deliberately neglected?
Yes. Yes.
This isn't just a history lesson. This is the untold story of how Hollywood's Mafia may have orchestrated the downfall of one of music's greatest legends. And if these rumors are true, it raises an even more chilling question. How many other stars met the same fate? Their deaths disguised as accidents or misfortune, when in reality they were victims of a ruthless industry that would stop at nothing to protect its secrets. Maybe the young Jackie Wilson knew his time on Earth was going to be short-lived. That would explain why he bolted through life at such a dizzying pace. He was throwing back cocktails and gambling at the age of 10, had his first child at 17, and maybe fathered countless others. He excelled at singing, dancing, and even boxing. He racked up stacks of money only to discover he was going to lose it all.
I couldn't hardly talk because I had been working so hard, with the other songs and on the road. And so I couldn't hit as Nat would call it, bird. They used to say, hit the bird.
Now let's go on a roller coaster ride with these facts about Jackie Wilson, Mr. Excitement. Jack Leroy Wilson Jr. was born on June 9, 1934 in Highland Park, Michigan, but he spent a lot of his young life further south in Mississippi. This was where his grandparents lived, and the church choir there had a huge influence on Wilson as a child. The influence, however, wasn't religious at all. It was only about the music. As it turned out, Wilson might have been better off in the long run if he'd listened to the preacher just a little bit.
And no one could hear it but me. I could actually hear the way that, well, I felt it. It was a church type thing.
The sermons at the Mississippi church were falling on Wilson's deaf ears, but heeding the preacher's words may have kept Wilson out of trouble. You see, Wilson lacked a strong role model. Back at his home in Detroit, Jackie faced a heartbreaking home life. Dad was generally not around. He was a big drinker and usually out of work. And then when Wilson turned 9, his father abandoned the family altogether. So Wilson, with no father figure in sight, looked around for someone else to be his role model. To say he made a poor choice is a devastating understatement. With Dad out of the picture, 10-year-old Jackie Wilson found other male mentors. Unfortunately, they were in street gangs. Wilson's gang of choice had the name the Shakers, and Wilson got into all kinds of trouble while under their tutelage. In addition to life on the streets as a gang member, Wilson was doing something else while he was out there.
Well, actually, I met Nat through the late Al Green, who was the manager of Laverne Baker at the time. And who were all from Detroit.
He'd sing his heart out for the money strangers would toss into his hat. Instead of using the money to improve his life, however, he spent it in the worst possible way. Even though Jackie Wilson was only 10 years old, he was using his hard-earned money not to buy toys, but booze. Gang life was obviously a bad influence on young Wilson, but it wasn't his only affiliation. Wilson's mom arranged for him to be a member of another group, a church choir. But how could Wilson be in both a gang and a church choir?
Actually, I didn't want to leave. My mother just grabbed me by the hair one day and told me no more.
You see, for Wilson, it wasn't about good or evil. It was only about the music. Wilson soon outgrew the choir and the gang and joined a gospel quartet called the Ever Ready Gospel Singers. Wilson, however, was only ever ready for more trouble. The Ever Ready Gospel Singers became very popular in local churches, and Jackie Wilson even earned money for his performance. After the concerts, the quartet shared the spoils of the church donations. In the evenings after the service, however, Wilson was taking big risks. He often put the money they made toward gambling.
Actually, what happened, I had a good record, and I had won Golden Gloves in Michigan with a mustache, and I was only about 16. I was supposed to be 18.
On many nights, Wilson walked away from the poker table with the entire quartet's earnings all for himself. Wilson was accumulating a long list of vices, all before becoming a teenager. Next on the list, making whoopee. Wilson began spending time with a girl named Freda Hood. The youngsters were not yet teenagers, but Hood reported that Wilson was more than a little knowledgeable about what went on in the bedroom. Wilson and Hood began an intimate relationship, one that would last for many years. Already, Wilson was living the life of an adult, and he'd barely reached puberty.
Nat was a young, hot-headed kid that wanted to get ahead, and he was doing all the publishing for Al Green. And, well, at least Al Green took me when I left the Dominoes.
Wilson loved boxing and hated school, which made his next decision a no-brainer. At 15 years of age, Wilson decided he'd had enough of school and quit, maybe thinking boxing would be his career of a lifetime. One day while in the middle of a match, Wilson's mom called out his nickname, Sonny, Sonny. It was a brutal mistake. When Wilson turned to look for his mom, his opponent used the opportunity to beat him to a pulp. Mom saw the brutal beating happen right before her eyes. At that moment, Wilson's mom knew that she would never allow boxing to be a part of her son's future.
She walked to the arena one night, and I was boxing, and I always look for a certain seat. He hollers out real loud, "Hey, Sonny!" And I turn around and whop. Wow.
Wilson's mom was horrified by what she saw at the boxing arena, so she turned to Wilson and made a demand. You've got to quit boxing. Surprisingly, Mom still had some major sway with the more than independent Wilson, because when Mom told him to quit boxing, he did it. We'll soon see, however, why Wilson was about to have no time for sports, or anything else for that matter.
I was shot in the stomach. And, well, I still have the bullet. I still carry it. It's in my back, but it's in a safe place. I just can't move it because it hasn't moved.
Wilson performed in various clubs until a talent agent noticed him and gave him an amazing opportunity. The Dominoes, an immensely popular R&B vocal group, was looking to replace their lead vocalist Clyde McPhatter. Miraculously, the talent agent got Wilson a chance to audition. McPhatter was a huge deal, but Wilson had a few tricks up his sleeve. Wilson walked into the audition for the Dominoes with a swagger that was beyond his years, and his wealth of experience as a singer. But it wasn't just a swagger, he also had something to say to the assembled Dominoes. Wilson stated unequivocally that he was a better singer than McPhatter himself. It knocked them off their feet. Whenever I'd get back on the block where everybody had heard my records, half the time I couldn't afford a Coca-Cola. According to McPhatter, the Dominoes sat there stunned at the young man's impudence, and then they heard him sing. Wilson's talent was so big that the Dominoes had to ignore his little faux pas. They hired him on the spot and asked him to do something just for them: change his name. Wilson's real name was Jack Wilson, but he often went by Sonny. The Dominoes wanted neither of these. They wanted Jackie Wilson, and the rest, as they say, is history. Wilson's bravado had paid off, but could he actually fill McPhatter's shoes? Jackie Wilson had bragged about being a better singer than McPhatter, but it actually didn't pan out that way. The Dominoes suffered from the loss of McPhatter and didn't do as well with Wilson at the helm. By 1957, Wilson came up with a secret plan. He wanted to leave the band, but who could he join up with? Well, Wilson pulled a surprise Beyoncé and went solo. He quickly put the word out that he was looking for new material to record, and one person who responded really stood out. The respondent who stood out was a young songwriter named Berry Gordy.
I had seen him perform at the Flame Show Bar as a special attraction, and I thought he was just the greatest singer I had ever seen.
The two had both been boxers, so Wilson and Berry really hit it off. Berry was the one who ended up co-writing Wilson's signature tune, Lonely Teardrop. Sadly, as we'll see, this tune would also play a role in the end of Wilson's career and his life. And what about Gordy? Well, Gordy went on to start Motown Records and changed the face of popular music forever.
My reputation increased tremendously after writing the Jackie Wilson stuff. In fact, that was my claim to fame.
With Gordy as his songwriter, Wilson's fame began to soar. Wilson was soon putting out #1 records, but to get the full Jackie Wilson experience, you had to see him perform. He got the nickname Mr. Excitement for 3 reasons: his dance moves, the passion of his voice, and his sense of style. He was an inspiration to many artists like James Brown and even Michael Jackson.
Some people are entertainers and some people are great entertainers. Some people are followers, and some people make the path and are pioneers.
In fact, the once king of entertainment was so moved by Wilson's performance that he demanded a meeting. Jackie Wilson met and befriended the king of rock and roll himself, Elvis Presley. It turned out to be a bit more of a mutual appreciation club. Music fans called Wilson the Black Elvis, which Presley countered with a hilarious response. He called himself the White Jackie Wilson. The two had a lot in common, and the #1 thing was controversy. In Elvis's own words, "I heard this guy in Las Vegas, Billy Ward and his Dominoes. There's a guy out there who doing a takeoff of me, don't be cruel. He tried so hard till he got much better. Boy, much better than that record of mine." Wilson's electrifying stage show, like Presley's, involved a lot of gyrations. Many parents of teenage girls thought Wilson's movements were offensive. Wilson, however, didn't stop with just thrusting his hips. He also removed his clothes. He'd start with the jacket and tie, suggesting to the audience that he was a little too hot. By the end of the performance, his sweaty chest would be front and center, thrusting hips, check. Clothes removed, check. What else could Wilson do to enrage conservative parents? Taking his clothes off was one thing, but what Wilson did with his props was, to some anyway, beyond acceptable. His rather intimate relationship with the microphone was simply described as suggestive. Wilson was also accused of pretending to unzip the fly of his trousers. It was only a matter of time before his show would get a warning, for mature audiences only. But as for the fans, they ate it up, and they were lining up to get on stage with Mr. Excitement. One person wrote, "This is heartbreaking. I saw Jackie several times in the 60s, and there was no one like him. Jackie did it all and sang like a bird on top of it." Another one added, "It's horrible that a man that great went out like that. He will always be one of the greatest until the end of time." During his performance, Wilson would always get the audience involved with the show. It was his routine to pull women from the audience and get them to kiss him. People started to notice Wilson always avoided choosing the most beautiful women from the audience for his nightly smooch. Likely they thought he was doing it out of kindness for those less blessed in the looks department. Sadly, the real reason was much more callous than that. It turned out that Wilson picked what he called the ugly girls out of the audience for a very selfish reason. He wanted to give America the impression that if an ugly girl could kiss him, then any girl could. It was his way of making his image and his records irresistible to his paying audience. Well, at a 1960 concert, Wilson was about to take it to the next level. The concert was in New Orleans, and Wilson had whipped the audience into a frenzy with his music and his suggestive dance moves. Some of the concert goers were so taken by the show that they wanted to be part of it and made a chaotic and savage run for the stage. Luckily, law enforcement was on hand to keep this from happening. Here's what Douglas writes about the riot. They had police lined up all around the stage. Larry Williams had his foot up on the piano like Little Richard. He was doing Dizzy Miss Lizzie, and he ran to the edge of the stage but didn't jump off. He got down on the edge of the stage and women came forward. White women. Jackie was standing backstage and the cops took Larry and pulled him into the audience and started beating him with their sticks. When Wilson had to face the consequences for what had happened that night, a judge laid down the law. He charged Wilson with assaulting a member of law enforcement. It could have spelled doom for his career, but Wilson had a way of bouncing back. Wilson's brush with the law didn't deter his rocket ship ride to megastardom. His performance, at least a very cleaned up one, made it onto the Ed Sullivan Show and American Bandstand. At the same time, he was performing sold-out live shows. He even, like his white doppelganger Elvis, appeared in a movie. His career was on fire. On February 15, 1961, Wilson came home to his Manhattan apartment with model Harleen Harris. While Wilson was trying to get Harris into his apartment, a crazed fan appeared. This wasn't so out of the ordinary until Wilson noticed a disturbing detail. She was holding a revolver. Wilson was in shock and assumed the worst. She was going to shoot him, Harris, or both. But the deranged woman did something that surprised everyone. She aimed the revolver at herself. Jackie Wilson said that it appeared that the crazed woman was going to shoot herself, so in a brave and valiant effort to save the stranger, Wilson jumped on the woman. 2 shots rang out and both ripped into Wilson's abdomen. Paramedics rushed Wilson toward Roosevelt Hospital. He needed immediate surgery in order to save his life. Would they get there on time? Wilson did get to the hospital in time, and doctors got right down to giving Wilson the surgery he needed to save his life. In the end, the doctors were successful, but Wilson would be left with 2 sad reminders of this near-fatal incident. He'd only have 1 kidney, and he'd have a bullet lodged in his spine for the rest of his life. We'd finally pulled him out and had to take him to the hospital. They took him to jail and we got him out. It took us a matter of minutes to get out of town. They had his picture in the paper where he hit the cop. The riot received coverage in the newspapers, which stated that police laid charges which ranged from attempted murder to assaulting police and inciting a riot. Wilson was booked with disturbing the police, inciting a riot, and assaulting an officer. Wilson had survived, and it was quite a fantastic story, but he was hiding the dark truth about that night. The truth was that Wilson didn't really try to save the crazed fan's life. Another truth? The woman wasn't a crazed fan. It was yet another girlfriend Wilson was stringing along. The woman's name was Juanita Jones, and she was furious when she saw Wilson with another woman. That's why she pulled out the revolver. Wilson's manager, Nat Tarnopol, had created the story about an obsessed fan to save Wilson's reputation. The management company, however, should have been saving something else of Wilson's, his hard-earned cash.
He didn't know how deep in the hole he was getting further and further in the hole to them, and the books were never honest anyway.
When Wilson's manager Tarnopol wasn't playing spin doctor for Wilson's messes, he was supposed to be managing Wilson's money. Well, it seems he wasn't doing a very good job of it. Wilson found himself suddenly broke. How was this possible?
Double dealing, double contracting, sheer ripping off of the act. The acts in those days were teenagers going against corporate people.
And as kids, you don't think that it's a cold business.
In 1961, when the average annual salary was just $5,000, Wilson declared an income of over $260,000. So where was all the money? Not only was Tarnopol bad at managing Wilson's money, it seemed he was also bad at paying the singer's taxes.
So I don't think he really knew, because he was always going to his managers and publishers for quote, advances or something that he would want to buy.
And Wilson was about to face the consequences.
And there was no protection of his money. In fact, it was actually stealing of his money. And saying, you now let's look at the books, you took this amount. Jackie was never aware, of how much he took or how much he was spending.
The IRS approached Wilson looking for all the tax money. about $300,000 he still owed them. Wilson hadn't seen this coming. He'd trusted Tarnopol to take care of things like paying taxes and investing his money. It seemed that Tarnopol had done neither. The IRS was not about to give Wilson a pass, and they began looking at Wilson's assets. They needed to take something valuable to pay off his debt. The IRS went on the attack and seized Wilson's house in Detroit, which is where his wife and children lived. But apparently this wasn't enough. Wilson had to set up a payment plan to get himself out of debt. In this, one of the most tragic times of his life, Wilson's wife left him. Hood had it with the cheating, the money problems, and all the drama.
My position at the time was I wanted to just take our son to visit with his father.
Drama? You call this drama? She should have stuck around to see what would happen next. In 1964, Jackie Wilson was performing at Kiel Auditorium in St. Louis. The authorities had been bothering Wilson about a certain $2,200 he owed from failing to fulfill a contract for a performance. Somehow, Wilson heard that officers were going to take him in following his St. Louis concert, so he did something jaw-dropping. After leaving the stage, Wilson jumped out of the club's second-floor window to avoid the officers. Regardless, authorities later caught up with him and he spent a night in prison, but his troubles didn't end there. Later, in March of 1967, Wilson found himself in trouble with the law again. He was on tour in South Carolina, and he and his drummer were looking for a good time. They met up with two young women and persuaded them to come to their hotel room. Officers soon descended on the hotel room and took Wilson and the drummer in. Why? Probably because the women were white. Wilson's reputation was at an all-time low, but Tarnopol, his unreliable manager, had a great idea to fix it. Wilson was having trouble getting over losing a son. Sadly, he turned to drink and use to soothe the pain, and as you might imagine, neither helped him. A few years later, he would face even more heartache. One of his daughters died after having a heart attack, and another got caught in the crossfire of a deal that went wrong. Clearly, being one of Wilson's children was nothing more than a ticket to a short life. Luckily, there was some good news on the horizon. Even though the benefit helped him financially, Wilson's health quickly went from bad to worse. He was unable to take in any nourishment, so they moved him to a hospital in Mount Holly, New Jersey. Eventually, Wilson caught pneumonia and quietly passed away. It was 1984 and Wilson was just 49 years old. Sadly, his problems weren't over yet. Jackie Wilson's estate still didn't have any money, so there was nothing to pay for a proper burial. Authorities had no choice. They laid his body in an unmarked grave. For the second time since his onstage collapse, the music community, this time led by disc jockey Jack the Rapper Gibson, banded together to collect money. Thanks to the support of fellow musicians and fans, Wilson's remains found a new home, in a mausoleum at a cemetery in Wayne, Michigan.